All right, welcome to Leadership Lincoln's Hot Topics. I'm Brendan Evans. I'm the Executive Director of Leadership Lincoln. And today, Hot Topics is going to be talking about eviction. And there's been a lot of great events in the community to participate in along those lines, including a great installation at History Nebraska, or the State Historical Society as it used to be, downtown. And that's through the end of the month. So if you're interested in a tour, you can contact them to have a COVID-safe private tour of the exhibition set up on eviction. I would like to thank our board of directors. They just put a ton of time in, especially this last year, navigating all the weirdness of trying to figure out COVID like everybody else is with a small organization. And we are so appreciative of their efforts. And also our Hot Topics Committee, which this year has really just stepped up and put forward a lot of community conversations in our Hot Topics forum, and we're Zooming them and then streaming that to Facebook. So it's really elevating the exposure and the message to a lot of these important issues. And just to kind of run through our tri-chairs really quickly are Steve Smith, Kathy Steinauer Smith, and Fred Seckman. But I'd like to thank all of our committee members on that because they've really put in a lot of time outside of this, including Pat Anderson Fuentes, Rachel Barth, Janet Chung, Morgan Gertzeisen, Jeff Kirkpatrick, Lisa Lee, Maura Pennis, Nancy Petito, Becky Roberts, as well as Joel Stoltenau. At the end of this week, we will be having a community conversation, which we've added this year, and it goes from 12 to 12:30. Just kind of a briefer look at what are the successes and challenges and how people can help with our own Lily Shagru, talking with community organizations, civic people, small businesses. This Friday is the Child Advocacy Center. So if you're interested, check out our Facebook page. And we are taking nominations for Leadership Lincoln Awards, our Bud Kuka Servant Leadership Award, our Melvin W. Jones Mentorship Award, as well as our Distinguished Alumni Award. So if you know someone who's deserving of recognition, I know there's just so many great leaders in our community that have stepped up this past year. Make sure to go to our website and submit a nomination form or send us an email, and we'll make sure that the committee has a chance to consider that nomination. Next month, shortly, we will be putting up applications for next year's Leadership Lincoln cohorts, our executive, fellows, advocates, and youth cohorts. So if you or someone you know would be a good fit for Leadership Lincoln, or you think Leadership Lincoln would benefit from their participation, please nominate them, send their nomination in, or encourage them to apply, and those will be forthcoming on our website. So just a couple of little housekeeping things. So Zoom norms, keep yourself muted and put questions in the chat box. Feel free to kind of use that chat box throughout the presentation by our panel. And with that, I will turn it over to Steve Smith. Thank you.
Hey, thanks, Brendan. And I am so thrilled that the weather is nice and that we are not, got all of our space heaters on right now for this session for many reasons. My name is Steve Smith. We're conserving Zoom bandwidth. This is my wife, Kathy. Kathy and I are two of the tri-chairs for the Hot Topics Committee. And of course, this conversation has come up a couple times in our planning for our planning committee. We know that 2020 and of course now 2021 has been drastically difficult. It's been a tough year for a lot of individuals and a lot of businesses and healthcare providers throughout Lincoln. So it's a good topic to have right now. I would like to introduce, let's just get real here. It's one of my favorite coworkers, Nancy Petito. She works with me at Civic Nebraska. She's also one of my fellow volunteers on the planning committee, and she's going to be our moderator for today's discussion. Nancy is the program director for the Collective Impact Lincoln Initiative, which lifts up Lincoln communities for resident-led change. Nancy, great to see you this morning.
Thanks so much, Steve. And I guess you can say that I'm your favorite coworker because all of our other colleagues are in an all-staff meeting right now.
That's right.
But hopefully, I'm sure they're going to check out this recording and we'll have some things to say. Well, I just want to thank everyone also for being here today. This is something that has been a topic of discussion a lot in our work within Collective Impact Lincoln and across other organizations. And so let's go ahead and start by introducing our panelists for today's discussion. And I think someone from the Leadership Lincoln team is going to drop some more detailed descriptions for our panelists' backgrounds in the chat. So if you're interested in checking that out. But first I'll introduce Mindy Rush-Chipman. Is the Equity and Diversity Officer and Director for the Lincoln Human on Commission Rights at the City of Lincoln. She's also been volunteering as an attorney with the Tenant Assistance Project since the beginning of the pandemic. So Mindy, thanks so much for joining us today. We also have Liz Woods, who works at Family Service Lincoln as a case manager, and Family Service is one of the public door agencies for coordinated entry. Thanks, Liz, for being here with us. Lynn Fisher is the owner of Great Place Properties. He also serves on the board of directors and the property management committee for the Realtors Association. Hi, Lynn, thanks for being here today. And then we have Senator Matt Hansen, who serves as the representative for District 26 in the Nebraska legislature. So Senator Hansen, thank you for joining us as well. Thanks to all of our panelists for being here today to have this very important conversation. So I'm going to kick things off with Mindy. We were hoping that you could kind of give us an overview of evictions, maybe the process, some of what you've been seeing at eviction court. If you just want to give us a rundown of that and provide us with that process, that would be really helpful to get us started.
Sure, thanks, Nancy. So as everyone on the call, I'm sure knows, evictions have proceeded throughout the pandemic. There was a time where the Lancaster County Courthouse was closed and in-person hearings were discouraged and prohibited, but eviction hearings never stopped. So because of that, myself and my friend Professor Ryan Sullivan recognized a need to provide some eviction defense to folks that were facing eviction during the pandemic. And we just started volunteering at the courthouse to provide folks representation right before their eviction hearing. Because of that, that effort has evolved into something more collaborative and more robust called the Tenant Assistance Project, or TAP for short. And I think my involvement in TAP is the reason why you asked me to join you here today. But backing up a bit, just talking a little bit about evictions. Evictions primarily happen because of the inability or failure to pay rent or some other type of lease violation. Evictions can also happen because the lease term, the lease ends, and the housing provider no longer wants to keep this particular tenant in the unit for any reason or no reason at all. So evictions can happen for a multitude of reasons, but one of the requirements of eviction is that the landlord provides the tenant proper notice of why the eviction is going to happen, wait the required timeline that the notice has to be served and waited out, and then file the eviction action in court. The eviction cases are super quick. Compared to normal civil litigation, eviction hearings happen really, really fast. So once the housing provider files the eviction action with the court, the eviction hearing has to happen within 10 to 14 days. Normally in civil litigation, when you receive a petition for a litigated matter, you have 30 days just to file your answer. But in eviction cases, you actually have to show up to the eviction hearing within 10 to 14 days. Before the Tenant Assistance Project started, a majority, if not all of the tenants would likely appear at their eviction hearing unrepresented or without an attorney. And that's for the tenants that were actually advised and were able to show up to their hearing. What that presents is it's a matter that is set up to be adversarial, where the housing provider and the tenant are able to present the facts of their case to the judge. But when one party is represented, and housing providers are typically represented in eviction hearings, nationwide, I think the figure is 90% of housing providers have attorneys representing them in eviction matters. So when you have that unequal representation, oftentimes unequitable outcomes could happen. In Nebraska, you can be evicted even if you didn't receive actual notice of the eviction. There's things called constructive and alternate service. So sometimes tenants are being evicted without actually having received notice of the eviction hearing date. And there's a lot of other, in my opinion, things that are happening, whether we're in a pandemic or not in a pandemic, that do make this adversarial eviction process create a lot of barriers for tenants to be able to assert their rights and to even know what their rights are. So that's why the Tenant Assistance Project, I think, is so vital. And then when you add in the fact that we're being given the recommendation and the guidance to not gather, to not go in public places, to try to isolate at home as much as possible. But then you're asked to come into eviction court that's oftentimes crowded and then be evicted, forcibly displaced from your home. It was a concern. So right now, due to the Professor Ryan Sullivan's assistance with the Nebraska College of Law Civil Clinic, and then Lori Heerdale, who is the director of the Nebraska State Bar Association Volunteer Lawyers Project, every day that there's eviction hearings, which they happen Monday through Thursday, 8:30, 9:30, and 10:30. Every day there's eviction hearings. The Tenant Assistance Project has volunteer attorneys, law students, as well as community organizers there to try to gain some more semblance of balance of power and equity in the courthouse and just provide that assistance, which honestly most of the time looks like the TAP volunteers trying to mediate or negotiate a mutually beneficial resolution for both the tenant and the housing provider. One of the more recent successes, I think, of the Tenant Assistance Project is that we're able to secure a housing rights coordinator who is able to take applications for rental assistance right there at the courthouse. So if the lease violation or the disagreement between the housing provider and the tenant has to deal with rent, hopefully we're able to alleviate that disagreement by applying for rental assistance right then and there. It's really a fast turnaround. If we can get the rental assistance application completed by a Wednesday, the check will get mailed out to the housing provider by Friday. So it's just the Tenant Assistance Project is constantly evolving to try to not only be there for the tenant and to meet the tenant's needs, but also try to meet the housing provider's needs as well.
Thank you so much for that overview, Mindy. That's really helpful to just kind of get that base level of knowledge on the eviction process. Next, I'm going to ask Liz, if you want to share a little bit. I know that you serve on the Lincoln Homeless Coalition, and so this has been something that's been top of mind for your group as well. Do you want to talk a little bit about what the Homeless Coalition has been hearing and seeing throughout the pandemic in regards to housing?
Sure, of course. Thanks for having me, Nancy. So I am here on behalf of the coalition, and basically the coalition is a collaborative group of organizations working together to address the issue of homelessness in Lincoln and Lancaster County. It's comprised of over 45 agencies, allied individuals, organizations, city and state partners who all work together to serve homeless and near homeless individuals and families within Lincoln. So this includes our Lincoln Continuum of Care, which is one of 3 COCs across the state that is distributing federal funding to counter homelessness. Part of this is the coordinated entry, which is a no wrong door approach for any individual or family that's experiencing homelessness. It's a centralized list of those people experiencing homelessness, and it's not a waiting list, but a priority list. So they have weekly meetings with various providers where they review all available housing openings and work to get people housed as quickly as they can. And another part of that is All Doors Lead Home. And so this is something that I am a part of as an LPAC case manager at Family Service. And so what we do is where our numerous public access points where people can call in and get some assistance if they are facing an eviction due to COVID-19. So numerous places such as Cedars, The Hub, Centerpoint, Community Action, Family Service, People City Mission or the Help Center and Matt Talbot are just a few of the non-public open doors with specific populations, and the Lincoln Commission on Human Rights eviction court diversion, which Mindy had just described. So being a part of the LPAC team, what we do is we help tenants apply for rent and or utilities assistance when they've had a loss of income due to COVID-19. So it's been a coordinated effort within the city of Lincoln. And so this has been comprised of Lincoln Community Foundation, UNL, CCFL, and with some of our new funding that's going to be coming on, it's also going to include the Children and Families Foundation. So all of these companies and organizations are working together. It's included various funding streams, so some of which we had used last year and they have been expended at the end of 2020. The funds that were recently released from the December 2020 federal COVID relief package included $25 billion in rental assistance. 13 million of those dollars were specified to Lincoln, Lancaster County area. And so we on the LPAC team are currently working as quickly as possible to stand up additional infrastructure to support the increased requests and distribution that is no doubt coming down the pipes. So our goal is to incentivize landlords, property managers, and tenants. Basically, we want everybody to encourage people to apply. If they're needing assistance, reach out to us. This new funding is also going to allow landlords to apply directly for their tenants. If that is something that the tenants and the landlords agree upon, that might be a mutual way to provide assistance. We've so far connected with 270 landlords over the process of this LPAC team kind of coming together. So right now, as Mindy had discussed, things can go pretty quickly if someone is in eviction court and they apply and that sort of thing. When it comes to working with an LPAC case manager, starting everything from scratch, things are currently sitting at about an average of 24 days from the time someone finishes an application to the time that checks are dispersed and kind of mailed out. It varies, but that's kind of an average time frame right now. With regards to the need, we've definitely seen an increase. Back in 2018, some of the numbers were looking at about 14% of the people living in the Lincoln area fell below the poverty threshold. So that put it at about 37,000. As of right now, it shows that about 12% of homeowners and 19% of renters are behind on their monthly payments when it comes to rent and mortgage payments due to COVID. As of January, we've distributed more than $1.5 million in assistance, on average about $2,500 per household in rent, mortgage, and utilities assistance. There are currently approximately 182 households in queue waiting for COVID assistance. So that means that they've completed the application and are waiting to receive any kind of final determination. So we're working as quickly as we can, and we have more people coming on board. We're working on that right now. So hopefully we can offer more assistance more quickly to more people.
That's incredible. Thank you, Liz, for explaining all of that to us and for all of your hard work and navigating that system. I'm sure it's not an easy task, but that's really great to hear that we have that additional funding available so we can help folks be able to pay their rent and utilities and move this along. So now I would like to ask Lynn to go ahead and talk to us a little bit about what can you share from your side of things, from your perspective, and from maybe what Great Place Properties is working on at this juncture.
Well, thank you very much, Nancy. And just briefly, if I could just give my background a little bit. I've been a landlord for 25 years. I'm currently president of the Landlord Association Lincoln, called RIOMA, also on the board of the statewide Property Owners Association. I serve on the Property Management Committee and also the Board of Realtors in Lincoln. I'm a junior achievement volunteer. I co-host a radio show on KZUM Radio, Our Street, where we talk about these issues a lot. We had a whole series on evictions that we covered in quite a lot of detail. I've also been a volunteer panelist, landlord panelist for RentWise, which is a really great volunteer program administered through community action that has served almost 15,000 tenants over 10 years, where we've provided a lot of great training and information and help people understand their rights and how to be the best tenant that they can be and avoid evictions. That's one of the big things that we talk about in RentWise, is how to avoid that particular situation. So in our company, and we have a property management company, and we manage about 700 doors for ourselves and for other clients, property investors and landlords that ask us to help manage their properties. And what we do is we serve tenants to the best of our ability. We provide very clean, safe, and affordable housing. Affordable being the key. I don't have any high-end properties. All of ours are the kinds of properties that we're talking about, where people maybe face eviction from time to time. And but they're all private properties, and they're all owned by private investors who are risk takers that are out there taking a risk to provide housing to folks. And so as a private property owner, we have private property rights, and the tenant's rights derive from a private contractual agreement. The lease is a private contract. So not until they engage us in private contracts do then they get their rights through the Landlord-Tenant Act. And so I know there's been comments made from time to time here recently about discussing evictions, about someone losing their home. That's true, but they don't own that property, and so that's a real key difference to keep in mind. But certainly, we want our tenants to understand their rights, and the last thing that we want to do is to end up in evictions. We have 99% of our tenants who are very well behaved, pay the rent on time, and but unfortunately, like all companies, we end up from time to time having to get to the eviction process, but we try to avoid it at all costs. And we do that by communicating with the tenants constantly about what's going on with with their rent payments, et cetera. If there's late rent, we immediately contact them. I know that Mindy, you mentioned that eviction is quick. It's a quick process compared to other kinds of civil action. And the reason is because it is a private property matter, and the income stream that we rely on in order to pay mortgages and bills and taxes and payroll and all the other things that go along with maintaining that private property at high risk is very critical to being able to continue to provide housing for people. And so we can't have a long drawn out process if we're going to get that property back to a income producing state. In Lincoln, there are roughly 50,000 rental units. On any given year, roughly 1,000 to 1,200 evictions occur. That's about 2.5%. It ranges from 2 to maybe a little more than 2.5% over the course of the last several years. So it's a very small percentage of people that unfortunately have to be dealing with evictions. But just to keep that in mind, you're looking at about 100 evictions per month out of 50,000 rental units, which represent, of course, probably more than 100,000, maybe a couple 100,000 people. If you look at the number of people that rent per unit, so that's something to really keep in mind. So tenants know what's going on. I just wanted to make that point. It's not a surprise that a tenant is asked to show up in eviction court. The law provides for service And if there's a tenant who is trying to avoid or evade the process, we still need to be able to get to that court as quickly as possible. So the constructive service is a tool that's very, very helpful. And it's not a surprise, believe me. Tenants know exactly what's going on. So let me just check my notes. I want to make sure I'm not missing something else here. I think that covers it. I just want people to know that we really do try very hard to serve our tenants and have a good relationship with them. And eviction is the last thing we want to do, believe me. It's not something that we enjoy. There's a big difference between non-payment of rent evictions and evictions for bad behaviors and for property protection. The three things we ask of tenants is we want them to pay the rent on time, to be a good neighbor, be respectful of their neighbors, take good care of the property, and be respectful of the property. If folks do that, as I said, 99% of tenants do that, everything is happy, everybody's good, we have great relationships. But unfortunately, we're all human, and you're going to end up with any group of people with situations and circumstances, some of them out of the control of the tenants, some of them within the control of the tenants. But that tool that we have to protect our private property rights through the eviction court is very, very necessary. And tenant education goes a long way to help them understand not only how to avoid eviction, but what happens when the eviction process is necessary. So I really appreciate the time to be able to explain from our perspective why it's very important and why we try to avoid it, but it does happen. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you so much, Lynn. We appreciate that. So thanks again for being here. So Senator Hansen, we have come to you finally. We want to talk a little bit, or have you talk with us a little bit about some of the housing bills that you've introduced over the last few legislative sessions, why you find those bills to be important, and what you've been focused on either this session or previous sessions that you think are things that we want to hear about today during this evictions conversation.
Sure, I'd be happy to talk about that. And thanks for having me on. From my perspective, talking about housing, I've been involved in a variety of different fronts because there's kind of two ways of addressing the problem, or two ways, multiple ways of getting involved. And I guess I'll specify is one is, we're talking about evictions, we're talking about kind of, Landlord Tenant Act. We're talking about specifically about that kind of existing relationship between providers and tenants in existing properties typically. But we're also talking about affordable housing in terms of how do we grow and generate and develop new affordable housing. This is different ways of working on different things, but kind of all approaching the same issue. One of the things that I've looked at and why it's so important to me is, time and time again, you go to different groups, you do different things, and you look at it, and it's, what is one of the biggest problems facing Nebraska? And it is the availability of housing. I think the Blueprint Nebraska study, for those who aren't familiar, had a working group of a variety of people looking at housing issues, and estimated that Nebraska was probably between 30 and 50,000 housing units short. I know in the past, the Nebraska Bankers Association has identified workforce housing as being one of the biggest needs, and just frankly, the availability of housing kind of at all levels and all price points is a huge need. And so that's something we've been looking at. So looking at, and we'll think it's appropriate to also talk about, when you get talked about affordable housing, what are you talking about? And for me, I always use the definition of cost burden. So affordable housing is when you're not cost burdened, and that is when you're not paying more than 30% of your income to your rent, to your mortgage, whatever it is. People sometimes occasionally use different terms and mean different things. So certainly, middle income housing, starter homes, whatnot, are things to look at as well. But talking about that base definition of cost burden is kind of the threshold of affordability. Specifically to what we've been talking about here today, some of the, so just be upfront, we kind of heard a bit of a proxy of the debate for and against a couple bills I've introduced this session. So LB 45 and LB 46 were some of the things that Mindy and the Tenant Assistance Project mentioned in terms of the ability for eviction hearings to be continued. Currently, evictions are the only court hearing in the state that are held to an extraordinary cause standard, whereas every other civil action or criminal action for that matter are held to good cause in terms of a continuance, in terms of rescheduling. Similarly, looking at the alternative service provisions for specifically landlord, residential landlord tenant act are different than other civil actions. I've also worked on this issue in the past. 2 years ago, LB 433 was my priority bill, and we did pass it. And that was kind of, to my understanding, the first time we had really opened up and looked at the residential landlord tenant act in Nebraska in quite a while. That did a couple things, including lengthening the notice period for failure to pay, evictions for failure to pay. It used to be a 3-day notice, now it's a 7-day notice. And it also streamlined and made security deposit returns it streamlined in much more automatic and clear in my view. And did a few other kind of small changes as well. Since that time, some of the discussions that we're having today were bills and ideas that we talked about 2 years ago, and we're still talking about now. And I know we're going to be kind of continued part of the discussion. Similarly, just on other bills and other issues, just this week, it's on my mind, it was yesterday, I introduced a bill in front of the Urban Affairs Committee to try and coordinate state housing policy. We, unlike the federal level, we don't have a state Department of Housing. There's no kind of state equivalent of that. And that's something we're seeing in other states. I stopped short of proposing a whole new department, but tried to consolidate some of that data, some of that information systems in a single location. And that was something that we had talked with housing developers, with realtors and others in the fall of, what's the biggest thing the state can do and, to help improve the overall quantity and quality of housing stock in the state. And one of the things we heard back was have a clear point person, have a clear point department, make it clear who the state leader is. And so that's something I know we're looking at the urban affairs level too.
That's great. Thank you so much, Senator Hansen, for sharing that with us. At this point, we're going to open things up for questions. So if you have any questions, please drop them in the chat. Somehow, this never happens. We are ahead of schedule, which is wonderful. But that means that we will have some time to go into breakout rooms. And so before I pose a few questions to our panelists, I will ask you to rename yourself according to which panelist you would like to be in a breakout room with. So you can hover over your image. There's 3 dots there, and it says rename. And so after your name, simply put which panelist you would like to be in a breakout room with. For example, I rename myself to Nancy Petito, Senator Hansen. And then after we pose a few questions to the group as a whole, we can break out and then maybe have some more individualized conversations, just depending on what you want to discuss. So we did have some questions come into the chat, and I'll just kind of open these up. And Senator Hansen, you hit on this a little bit. Obviously, it sounds like there is a need for more affordable housing in Lincoln, in Nebraska. And besides some of the efforts that you just described to us, what are some other things that are maybe happening in our city within Lincoln to increase affordable housing stock? I don't know if anyone on the panel would like to take that question.
I can take a start. I know the city of Lincoln just released recently an affordable housing action plan that they had worked on with a lot of different stakeholders over time. And that's a really good first step. And it's actually something we're trying to get other cities across the state to model in terms of kind of taking that affirmative action and view that it is a role of the city to make sure that, there is available housing. And that's the report's available online for anybody who's interested in it. And that you can kind of see the different impacts of housing across the state, the age of housing stock, different types of homes, and kind of what they view are some of the missing areas. So that's something excited to see Lincoln be a leader on.
Does anyone else have anything to add to that? We can move on if not. All right. So looking at the questions that I have here, are there laws or expectations in leases that also provide for property owners and management companies to take good care of their property?
I can answer that. So yes, there are housing codes, and of course minimum standards, whether it be for just any licensed property in town or any rental property for that matter. And then for those that are on housing, Section 8, there's an additional layer of inspections and requirements that are nothing out of the ordinary. But absolutely, there's an ability for tenants to demand that certain standards be kept up in their rental unit, and they can certainly tap into resources through the health department and building and safety if a landlord is not responsive to their request for repairs and maintenance and upkeep, and they certainly need to do that.
Thank you, Lynn. That's helpful. Let's see. There's a lot of questions coming in right now, so I'm just trying to keep track of what we've asked. Does Lincoln follow, and hopefully someone can answer this or have an idea, does Lincoln follow national trends that eviction impacts communities of color more adversely, particularly single African-American women with children? Has anyone on the call been able to track that or have some statistics?
I can start. So at the beginning of this event, Brendan mentioned that there's an evicted exhibit at the Nebraska State History Museum. That evicted exhibit is based off the Evicted book by Matthew Desmond, and he did a comprehensive study of evictions and the impact of a city, is it Milwaukee? Somebody can correct me. And what he found is that the community members that are most likely to be impacted by eviction are, in fact, women of color with children. And so, and that's just not specific to Milwaukee, that's happening across the nation. Here in Lincoln, I think the last data point that I saw is that almost 65% of our households that include people of color are in rental properties, so not homeownership. And then just anecdotally speaking, when I do volunteer at eviction court, there are significantly more tenants of color and tenants with disabilities than otherwise. Just an anecdotal experience that I had with another TAP volunteer is she asked me, why are all the attorneys and landlords white and all the tenants of color, and it happened to be that's what it was that day. And that's not how it is every day, but statistically speaking, there are disproportionately more tenants of color and more tenants of disabilities that are appearing in eviction court to try to prevent the being forcibly displaced.
Thanks, Mindy. So you had mentioned in the chat earlier that there have been approximately 1,000 eviction cases in Lancaster County since the TAP was created in April of 2020. One of the questions that came through the chat was just sort of mentioning that's a lot of evictions and eviction hearings. And so I think a lot of folks are under the impression that with the federal moratorium, the CDC moratorium, that evictions would or should have been halted during COVID. And maybe you can't answer this in its entirety, but how are hearings and how are they still able to move forward even with that moratorium at the federal level?
No, that's a great question, and it's actually a common misconception that community members have. They've heard that there's a eviction moratorium, and so they feel that they're protected from evictions right now during the pandemic. But unfortunately, the CDC declaration only covers certain types of evictions, and it's just an affirmative defense that tenants actually have to take steps to benefit from. So the CDC eviction moratorium only prevents the eviction from going forward in failure to pay cases. So if a tenant is behind on rent, then they could potentially take advantage of the CDC eviction moratorium, but they have to take steps to do so. They have to ensure that they qualify, they meet certain guidelines to qualify for the moratorium, and then they have to sign an attestation, or if they have to sign a declaration and provide it to their landlord. A lot of community members don't know about those additional requirements or additional steps. And so unfortunately, what happens is those cases continue and those tenants don't show up to their hearing because they think they're protected under the moratorium. If a tenant doesn't show up to their hearing, they're going to be evicted. So we have tenants that are being evicted because they mistakenly believe that they're covered under the CDC eviction moratorium. And those are for failure to pay cases. The cases besides failure to pay cases, so the cases where there's a lease violation or an alleged lease violation, or in a case where the lease is over and the landlord wants to terminate that rental agreement for whatever reason or no reason at all, those cases are not stopped by the CDC moratorium. And so what we have seen is even if the underlying motivation for the eviction is failure to pay rent, a landlord can bring the case in another fashion and then not be prevented by the CDC eviction moratorium. Of course, we're making those arguments to the court that this really is a failure to pay case, and it was the intention of the CDC to stop those cases as well. But those are what we've seen. I have kind of an update number. Since the CDC moratorium was enacted on September 4th, the Tenant Assistance Project has helped about 60 households use that CDC moratorium declaration in order to get the eviction case continued. But unfortunately, many more of the folks that were evicted and didn't show up to their hearing could have benefited from the CDC moratorium. They just didn't know about it. They didn't know how to utilize it.
If I can jump in, the number that was cited, 1,700 filings, are only the filings, and that's about average for a typical year, even though 2020 was a COVID year. And the number of evictions in 2020, I'm guessing were no more, or maybe even possibly less than an average year. At least that was we had actually fewer evictions in 2020 than we've had in the past, because of the rental assistance programs that have been really great. And of course, I want to thank the Tenant Assistance Project attorneys for being there in court, because it certainly has helped tenants to understand and to get some help if they weren't clear on what their rights were. So it's been a great benefit. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for that information. Just to switch gears a little bit, Liz, you spoke earlier about the assistance funds, the COVID funds and the rental assistance funds that have been made available. Have those funds been easy enough for folks to access, or even for landlords or for tenants, or are there any barriers that make it difficult to get those funds and be able to pay your rent and, to kind of keep things from getting to that point of eviction?
Sure. I think right now the biggest constraint that we have is the amount of need versus the amount of people that are working to secure that funding and work on the assessments. And so we are working on, hiring extra people, and we're continuing to change how we organize things and go about things to make things more efficient for our tenants to call us and that sort of thing. Right now, there's different access points across the city. You can call any of those organizations and try and connect with someone. We're seeing right now there's a slow, steady increase. So approximately 2 to 3 weeks ago, I would average about 12 to 15 calls per day for people reaching out for assistance. Within the past week and a half, I've seen an increase to 30 to 40 calls per day to my phone alone. That's not including the other agencies. So we've seen this slow increase. So I think that would be the biggest barrier that I can see right now. Again, we're working to change how we do things. We've, toyed with numerous ideas of how do we make it even easier for tenants. Maybe that is only having one number to call and then some kind of system where it filters out naturally to, the different organizations. There's just been lots of discussion about how do we make it more efficient. So we're working on it. We're also working on hiring more people for our LPAC team to, again, get those in and out and be as efficient as possible.
That's great. And I kind of have a follow-up to that. There was a question from the Facebook live feed. Do these funds go to the landlords directly once the paperwork is filled out? This person knows individuals on both sides. And if there were different standards set for the eviction process that provided more time for tenants, could property owners build that into their business plan and revenue plan?
I can speak to the fact that payments are made directly to the landlord. So after someone fills out the application and it's processed and all of that, the check is cut and mailed directly to the landlord. So nothing goes to the tenant, and all discussions are had with the landlord over the phone or via email to discuss with them kind of the process and the general time frame we might be looking at that particular moment.
Great, that's helpful. Lynn, have you utilized any of these funds, or do you know other landlords that have been able to utilize them? Have there been any issues from that side of things, or any barriers in that process?
Well, yes, we've utilized them or our tenants have utilized them. Just recently, meeting with the mayor, we've asked for some guidance on how landlords can tap into the program. Frankly, it's very complicated. We're just now trying to figure it out. It's 16 or 17 pages of fine print, detailed information on how to go through the process. So we've certainly throughout the whole course of the year, we passed on to our tenants who are in need how to tap in, who to contact, which agency that they can contact. There's been a list put out there that landlords are certainly aware of and have been utilizing to provide to their tenants for most of the year. And so, and we haven't really experienced a lot of problems with getting rent paid either through those programs or by just working out a payment program for our tenants. And subsequently, we haven't done any non-payment of rent evictions at all. The only evictions we've been doing are for people who are destructive or bad behaving.
Thanks, Lynn. Kind of a technical question here, but how are tenants made aware of eviction hearings? So one of the questions that was put in the chat, is that through the court or mail, or how does that look?
I think Lynn touched on that. First, the landlord has to provide a written notice to the tenant, and the landlords do that in a variety of ways, typically either by mailing or taping to the door or mailing. Once that notice period is up, then the landlord would file that action with the court, and then the tenants are served with the eviction paperwork, which is supposed to be served like normal service. But if the landlord states that they're unable to deliver the petition to the tenant in person, then they can do alternate or constructive service, which is like a taping to the door or mailing. And what we found at the Tenants Assistance Project is oftentimes when the landlord reverts to constructive or alternate service, the tenant isn't fully aware of what's going on or the date and the time of their eviction hearing and the importance of showing up to that hearing.
If I can just comment, Mindy, you're correct in the process. However, you have to kind of go back to the beginning, and landlords and tenants are in communication all the time whenever there's an issue or problem, particularly with not paying rent. And so, we always let our tenants know that they need to work with us. If they don't, or they're not able to, then we explain what's going to happen. It's never a surprise to a tenant to know that there's an eviction underway. Whether or not they try to avoid getting served, that's just something that some people do, unfortunately. But that's why constructive service, posting on the door and mailing are what's provided in law through the Landlord Tenant Act for us to be able to have done in order for them to know what the time and date of the hearing is. So, but it's never a surprise.
So I think I'm going to ask a couple more questions to the larger group here. And please remember, if you want to go into a breakout room with one of our 4 panelists, to just rename yourself and indicate which person you'd like to go into a breakout room with. If you have any trouble renaming yourself, you can direct message Lily or Laura, our Leadership Lincoln team. So I have a question here that asks, was anyone doing outreach to landlords to tell them about the moratorium so they could respect those protections and make sure their tenants were aware?
I think Lynn, through his role at Rioma, they have a newsletter, and I think you have regular meetings. So if you could describe your outreach through Rioma, that would be awesome.
Well, yes, not only the Rioma group, but the Statewide Property Owners Association puts that information out, as well as the realtors put the information out to all the big groups. There's the Apartment Association for the larger complexes. And yeah, there's many methods of communication that landlords can tap into. Not to say that there aren't disengaged, small operators that don't know what's going on, but certainly the tenants and tenant advocates have been able to put that information out there, and hopefully most landlords are aware.
Thank you, Lynn, for that. Let's see, trying to work my way through this list here. So I think we had this question in the chat early on. Why is there an increase in increase of need of rental assistance when our unemployment rate is at 2.9% in December of 2020? This seems like it's possibly an underemployment problem, or wages are potentially too low. This seems like a bigger problem than just COVID. What do we do when COVID funding goes away?
I'll tackle that one. The answer is yes, basically. And for context for everyone, one of my other focuses is I'm on the Business and Labor Committee and the past chair that focuses on employment law, unemployment, and things of that nature. And the answer is yes, is we're seeing very much that the pandemic did not hit everyone the same. It disproportionately impacted some groups, including one of the groups that seems disproportionately impacted is women in general. And there's a lot of people who are employed, who are not employed at the same level, the same hours, the same salary, the same wages as before. And so we kind of see that reverberate through. That's part of the reason you see that is it's not necessarily just it's not just that. And in addition, as a kind of a constant and always reminder is a reminder that the unemployment rate is of people who are seeking and looking for work. So people who are unable to work or have chosen to withdraw from the labor market for whatever reason aren't necessarily always considered in that rate.
Thanks so much, Senator Hansen. I think at this point, we still have about 20 minutes left, but I think we're going to get put into some breakout rooms with our panelists so we can have some individual conversations. Oh, I need to give a little bit more time so people can be put into those breakout rooms. Okay, let me ask a couple more questions here. Let me go to the list. Is there any portion of the recovery dollars that goes to help smaller property owners to deal with the lost revenue and be more flexible with some of the tenants of those properties?
I think that's functionally what the rental assistance is it's to help out the landlords and make sure people stay home.
Lynn, did you want to add anything to that?
Well, yeah, I apologize. I was reading a question in the comments. So can you repeat the question, please?
Sure thing. is there any portion of the recovery dollars that goes to help smaller property owners to deal with the lost revenue and be more flexible with some of the tenants of those properties?
Nothing. I don't think there's anything specific for landlords. There's the PPP loan was out with the CARES Act, and I know we were able to tap into some of that, and that applied to any size business. So, and it was based on payroll. So that was about the only help. I know we're not talking about commercial properties, but that's where we've been hit the hardest. We have commercial properties that have really been hit hard. The residential side of it, because of the rental assistance, that's been pretty stable for us and for our tenants. So most of our tenants are in good shape, and those that need the help have been able to get it. So it's not really been a real big need for residential property owners, I don't think, to have any particular assistance as long as the tenants get help.
Sure, that makes sense.